Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Rajasekhara, who was a late 9th or early 10th century Sanskrit poet. I'm reading a very small selection of his works out of the North Indian Anthology. And according to their introduction, he was probably the son of a powerful court official in the Gujara Prajitara kingdom in north central India. Rajasekhara is a pretty cool poet. Like many Sanskrit, there's a lot of Sanskrit poetry about love, about sex, etc., etc. One of the things that makes Rajasekhara really unique is that he apparently openly acknowledged his wife's literary influence on him and her abilities as a writer in her own right. It says here, he's especially famous because he publicly acknowledged his wife, Avanti Sundari, as his equal in learning and taste, crediting her for his own literary success. And he was the first Indian author to do so. So, with that context in mind, Rajasekhara is a very, very interesting writer in terms of how he approaches describing women, describing love, describing eroticism, etc., etc. So I'm going to take you through a couple of his poems. The Norton Anthology only gives us 3 poems of his. And it does say here, these short poems are verses taken from his plays, so we're missing a larger context here, but they do work as standalone poems. That being said, they don't have titles. They once again have numbers, like a number of the other Sanskrit poets I've talked about in different videos, so I'm going to dispense with the numbers and just focus on the content of the poems themselves. So this first one here. When people see her face, they stop talking about the moon. When they see her skin, there's no more talk of gold. Water lilies lose the contest against her eyes. What's the nectar of moonlight when compared to her smile? And the love god's bow is nothing when held up to her eyebrows. But why say more? The truth is too well known, that in the order of creation, the Creator shuns repetition. So, the first thing that I think is noteworthy here is that to some extent, this poem uses a lot of well-worn poetic metaphors, comparisons between the beloved and moonlight or the moon, comparisons with gold or precious jewels or whatever it is, comparisons with flowers, etc., etc. These are all very, very common love poem tropes. But, to be fair, in the 9th and 10th centuries in north central India, I don't know how sort of generically stereotypical these were, though they do show up. I mean, even if you go back to like ancient Egyptian love poetry, which is some of the earliest recorded love poetry that we have, you're still seeing these comparisons to flowers and to precious metals and things like this. So I think this is kind of a universal poetic trope. But as with some of Shakespeare's sonnets, where he uses these very recognizable comparisons, Rajasekhara takes us in a different direction at the end of the poem. These last 4 lines, but why say more? The truth is too well known, that in the order of creation, the Creator shuns repetition. So there's a couple of ways we can read this ending. Personally, for me, I think this ending is a turn. What in a sonnet would be called a volta, a turn at the end of the poem where you think you know where the poem is going, but then there's a shift to a new idea. I think this, again, is very much like a lot of Shakespeare's sonnets. About that deal with the question of immortalizing the beloved in verse. So when he says here that in the order of creation, the creator shuns repetition, the way that I read that is Rajasekhara saying, my poetry, even though I compare you to these beautiful things, can never do you justice. You are beyond the language of poetry you're beyond the power of poetry to express your beauty, your values, your quality, the reasons why you are worthy of love, etc., etc. So that's a very interesting turn at the end of that poem, because again, it starts as a relatively conventional love poem using metaphor to try and establish how beautiful the beloved is, etc., etc. But then it takes us to that element of sort of literary self-awareness at the end. And I think that's a really effective way of making what could risk being a fairly standard love poem do that much more work. Another one that I think is interesting in a very different way is this one. Youthfulness inscribes all her parts, but is especially skillful in her eyes' maturity. For her gaze gathers all the expressions of whichever man she chooses to look at, and then conveys back to him all that he feels as the one who looks at her, whom she has found worthy of her gaze. Now that's really, really interesting from the perspective of a contemporary feminist reading. There's a lot of feminist theory about the gaze, particularly the male gaze, and the way that the male gaze as a form of social power constructs women's identities. What we have here is almost a subversion of that, in that the person being described, the woman being described, seems to actively absorb the characteristics of the male gaze and use them for her own purposes. She turns back on the male gaze, the object of the gazer's desire. Now, it's possible that we could read much of this poem in terms of that feminist idea that the male gaze constructs the female as a subject, or as an object to be observed. But I think the last line challenges that reading. This, whom she has found worthy of her gaze. This is clearly a woman who is looking back, gazing back at the gazer. And she reflects male desires. She reflects the ways in which the male gaze constructs her as a female subject. Because, and this is both something that psychoanalytic criticism and feminism in a maybe more contested way tells us, reflecting back the desire of the gazer is a way of, it is how attraction works. Like, I think it was Lacan who says something to the effect that we are most attracted to in others what reminds us of ourselves, or something to that effect. It might have been Freud who said that, but it was one of them, Freud or Lacan. I think it was Lacan, but don't quote me on that. Look it up for yourselves. Do your own research. # do your own research. But in this case, legitimately, actually look into Lacan. Anyway, sidetracked. But the idea here that the idea here, I think, the economy of this poem runs on the idea that what we find attractive in others, particularly men, because we are socially empowered in patriarchal societies, what we find attractive in a life partner is what is reflected back to us about our own desires. So what the thing that we want, the thing that defines our desire or shapes our desire, when that is reflected back to us, we find that most attractive. What this woman in Rajasekhara's poem seems to do is to consciously play with that awareness, to choose for different men what she will reflect back in order to maximize her attractiveness for any man that she feels is worthy of her gaze. So we have here a counter gaze that utilizes the constructing function of the male gaze as a means to achieve this woman's ends. And I think that's really fascinating.